Mike Johnson is the newly elected Speaker for Congress, and I'm very concerned for many different reasons. First and foremost, this guy is a young earth creationist. He thinks that the earth is less than 6,000 years old. He believed that Adam and Eve were real people, that humans lived together with dinosaurs, and that the events of Noah's Ark literally occur.
The Ark Encounter is one way to bring people to this recognition of the truth that, what we read in the Bible are actual historical events, and that there are implications to what you do with all these stories in the Bible there. But
on many different occasions, he openly spoke out against the very notion and the idea of separation of church and state.
What's happened, Alex, over the last 60, 70 years is that our generation has been convinced that there's a separation of church and state. Right? We heard that term all the time. And most people think that that's part of the Constitution, but it's not.
Also in the past, he openly advocated against the ideas of gay marriage.
You once worked for the Alliance Defense Fund, a Christian advocacy group,
Yep.
and comments you had made both in writing and advocacy for this group about homosexuality, calling it sinful, destructive, and not supporting gay marriage. Quote, no clear right to sodomy in the Constitution. You have been getting hammered on this.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you about it. I want to know exactly, where you stand. Some of these comments were 15 years ago.
I don't even remember some of them. I was a litigator that was called upon to defend the state marriage amendments. If you remember back in the early 2000s, I think it was over 35 states, somewhere in that number, that the people went to the ballot in their respective states and they amended their state constitutions to say marriage is one man, one woman. Well, I was a religious liberty defense lawyer and I was called to go in and defend those cases in the courts.
First and foremost, I'm not necessarily surprised that this guy is like a young earth creationist, largely because 40% of the American population literally thinks that the events as told in the book of Genesis are literally true, and so naturally a population that thinks that the book is literally true, about 40% of them, of course it's more likely that person might be elected in comparison to some other people. Based upon the historical data, we do in fact know that the main reason why something like the flood actually occurred in Genesis is not necessarily based upon a literal worldwide flood, but rather based upon a local flood that took place in Sunapek, where basically more or less it inspires stories like the story of Adaharas, the story of Gilgamesh, and much later on the book of Genesis on why that whole entire story was written down in the first place. Also, based upon scientific data, we do in fact know that the Earth is actually 4.5 billion years old, and that the universe more or less is over 13 billion years old, according to the latest data. Additionally, it's worth pointing out that the founding fathers of our country pointed out the importance of the separation of church and states on many different occasions. It's not necessarily a requirement for people to use holy text to enter into office. Thomas Jefferson plainly stated out loud that that whole entire phrase, that Congress cannot make an establishment of religion, is a direct reference to the separation of church and state. I'm also concerned about the status of gay marriage, largely because one of the court justices actually said out loud that he wants to review cases like gay marriages in the future, and so by having this kind of guy in power for the House Speaker, he might be pretty much empowered to do so thanks to this guy. This guy is not necessarily good news. Not necessarily good news in the slightest.